All right. Banger conversation today. I hope. I'm a little nervous. That's why I'm playing the piano before. My phone's kind of broken. Can you see? I'm speaking to James Filler, DC Schindler, and Matthew. Now, I spoke to David and Matthew before, the three of us. I thought that was a very successful conversation about what is church. Um, that conversation reached into beautiful depths, and I felt that we really connected there. And then I had James on twice on the channel. I think he's incredibly insightful. I think he hasn't spoken to a lot of people yet on the internet. And I think there's a lot of potential for his ideas to converge with others and for that to forge fruitful connections and new ideas. And so I recently listened to David on New Polity, I believe the channel's called. He spoke with his dissertation student, and it was about liberalism, about rights, I think about property as well. And if you've been on this channel for a while, you know that I do have an interest in Austrian economics, somewhat of a libertarian worldview I find interesting as well. I've done a lot of reading into into Austrian economics, and this is all related to liberalism. And I've seen that as a somewhat productive counterforce toward collectivism, forms of socialism that I think can be more destructive. But I'm seeing issues with that as well, with the more libertarian leaning, individualized worldview that takes the individual as the most real. I think that that causes all sorts of trouble. And I want to bring these three gentlemen together. Why Matthew as well? Because I think Matthew has really good insights on what an individual is, what an individual isn't, about debt. He knows David's work really well, and he speaks often from a creation point of view, and he'll explain probably in this conversation what that's supposed to mean. But I'm really excited to bring them all together today for hopefully a very fruitful conversation. So without further ado, here is Dr. DC Schindler, Dr. James Filler, and plain old Matthew and plain old Lucas to have a beautiful conversation, hopefully. Enjoy. Okay, yeah, David. Liberalism, take it away.
Take it away. I
Take it
wish I
away.
could take it away. Uh, uh, so liberalism. I mean, when we hear the word these days, we always think immediately liberal versus conservative. We have this polarity inside our general political system, but that's not what the word means, as I'm going to talk about, and I suspect that as we're want to discuss it here. From the larger perspective, liberalism is just, in a certain sense, it's another word for modern politics, modern political
Ah,
theory, which
hmm.
has its roots all the way back in the 16th century, and all of the different parties in the contemporary world. There might be an exception. I'll talk about it in just a second, but are basically variations of liberalism from this broader perspective. So, conservatives and liberals are. Alistair McIntyre made this point. It's really a debate between progressive liberals, liberal liberals, conservative liberals, libertarian liberals, but they're all variations on liberalism. I said that communism and sort of Marxism might be. I think it shares some of the basic assumptions, but it might be an approach to politics that doesn't quite fit in the liberal model. So setting that just in a nutshell, liberalism is basically an idea that the fundamental political unit is the individual, and really
Yes.
the isolated individual. And everything else gets all of the political order gets sort of stacked or built on top of that conception of this radically independent individual. And so this inclines one to sort of a social contract theory
Hmm.
of political order. So where do we get the institutions? Well, individuals agree to this, at least implicitly, as a way of protecting their, as the most sort of beneficial arrangement for them as political agents. To maybe set that to help set that into relief, you might contrast that with the pre-modern, sort of pre-liberal sense of politics, which is that politics is fundamentally founded on human nature, and human beings are relational by nature. And in a certain sense, the most basic unit of the pre-modern political order is the family, or the household, the usually understood in a much broader, richer sense. And from that perspective, which is much more concrete, you take as your basic reference point some notion of the common good. The politics is about how do we best distribute the common, communicate it to all of the people that constitute a community. Whereas in the, and that implies then that you have a very distinctive and deliberate, conscious vision of what a human being is, what we're made for, what life in this world is all about. The liberal form of politics, again, begins in a certain sense with the Reformation and the division between Catholics and Protestants. That there are deeper roots to it, actually, in the late Middle Ages, metaphysically speaking. But that's where things really start to sort of hit the rubber hits the road. There, you set aside these big questions of what human beings are for. You set aside a notion of a common good, and you think of politics as mainly occupied with establishing a neutral space where individuals can
Yeah.
kind of work out life for themselves.
Hmm.
So that would be kind of a nutshell version of what liberalism is.
Wonderful.
And
Thank
I
you
can
so much.
elaborate any point of that
Yes.
or whatever, but
Okay.
I'm also happy to hand the baton on here.
Yeah. Well, before I move on, do you guys have any questions about what David just said? Any clarifications? Everything's clear. Then I will ask a question to James. Um, how is a substance ontology perhaps related to the shift we make into liberalism, if at all? Is there a
Well,
link?
well, you're hearing him talk about, liberalism is grounded upon this idea of the isolated individual as a single unit. That is a completely substance understanding of the individual, and uh, I thought it was interesting. What I was reminded of when you were talking, David, was a line in the Republic where can't remember whether it's Glaucon or Adeimantus is talking to Socrates, and he says, your people aren't going to be very happy in this city. And he says, "Oh, I'm not concerned about the individual happiness. I'm talking about the best city as a whole. That's what we're after, is the best city as a whole." And so it's not about the individual and their happiness. It's about what's best for the whole. And yeah, I think that's
Can I just add a little parentheses to that point? Um,
sure.
it is interesting. Then a few lines later, he says, "But it wouldn't surprise me if the individual is happiest in this system." I mean, which is, and I think that's actually an important and really remarkable thing. So in a way, the individual isn't the focus, but the individual has all needs met too. It's not like the
Right.
individual gets
Right.
excluded or left out.
Yeah. So, what was the rest of your question, Lucas? I forgot.
Well, that
Sorry.
was the beginning
It's
of the
early for
question, just the
me.
relation. No, no worries. That's all good. How substance ontology is related to liberalism coming onto the scene.
Yeah, I think it's probably in ways I haven't explored the political side of this at all, but yeah, focus on the individual
Yeah,
uh, as an isolated unit is quite grounded in the substance idea.
exactly. Well, so when I look at today's days and age, I do see a lot of things going right, and I think there would be a lot of people listening to this and maybe wondering, well, we're talking about liberalism as maybe a bad turn, but aren't we doing so well? Or don't we have so much purchasing power? Don't we have so much freedom to travel, to make our own decisions? Maybe David, what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. A couple of things. First, just to reinforce what James said there about the substance ontology. I think it's really helpful and crucially important to recognize that there is a metaphysics, a certain interpretation of the nature of reality that's at the foundation of liberalism. So, people might think that this is just a political issue and has a political solution, but it's actually a much more radical and complex
Yes.
thing. And we really need to think down to the level of metaphysics and substance and relation and those sorts of questions are right at the heart of this. So that just to first make that comment, but specifically in relation to your question, there is a certain sense in which it's true that one thing people will point to is how the quality of life has increased globally. So even if there is a problem, perhaps people might want to say with certain individuals becoming super wealthy in the way that history has never seen before, over and against the very poor. Still, the very poor now are better off than the very poor, centuries ago. So, on the whole, it kind of benefits everyone. And I would want to say a couple. I mean, that's a huge question. It's a very important question. It's crucial that we take that seriously. But it seems to me we need to really reflect deeply and concretely on the question of what it means for the quality of life to increase. And when people make that comment, they just talk about um, disposable wealth or income levels or those kinds of things. And what it means to be a flourishing human being is not something that can be quite measured in those categories. So it's not clear that we can make a judgment that people are better off in
Yeah.
one respect. And to help illustrate that, because it could be the case that we're spreading wealth more than the world had before, but the kind of wealth that we're spreading might actually be, you know, causing a kind of degeneration of quality of life. And I think an analogy once occurred to me that I find really illuminating. Here's an interesting question. With the amount of social media that we have, the internet, smartphones, and all the rest, would you say the that the quality of our communication has increased
Well, no.
globally?
Yes.
I mean, do you see? I mean, in a certain sense, you wouldn't want to say yes because now we can be in touch with everybody immediately. But precisely because we can be in touch with everybody immediately, arguably the quality of the communication is gone. Now we misunderstand each other much more radically. We have far more communication problems. So
Yeah.
I think in a way liberalism is like that. And on one level, it's made things better, but there could be, and I suspect that there is, at a deeper level, all sorts of deep human questions that are being eclipsed or challenged.
Can I ask
Okay.
a question? Have you seen, David, The Social Dilemma? Um,
Yes, yeah,
because some of the things you were talking about, just, you know, I started showing that to my class because I think it's a very important documentary. And one of the lines in there, you talked about how we got to get back to understanding the metaphysical foundations of our worldview. And it struck me as one of the main problem both Tristan Harris and Roger, was it McNamara, the investment
I don't.
banker? I can't
Yeah,
remember the names. Um, but they said, Roger was first, he said, the biggest problem we have, the reason that, social media is a problem with these algorithms that create polarization. But the bigger problem we have is that we have no shared understanding of reality.
yeah.
And Tristan
Mm.
Harris said, we have no common understanding of truth. And if we don't have any common understanding of truth, and I see the two being the same way, same thing, because in my view, truth is correspondence with reality. And so, if we don't have a common understanding of reality, we have no common understanding of truth. And then it just becomes completely subjective. Whatever your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth. And it drives this problem because we have no common ground on to talk to each other from. Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, no, and I mean, if you just think about what the implications of that are, they just go on and on forever. I mean that, it's interesting. We I think we disintegrate even as individuals. It's not like it's just that the individuals get
Mm.
separated from society. I think we start to collapse inside. We can't even make sense of ourselves anymore, uh, without a sense of what truth is
Yeah.
truly.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, you told me that recently that individual, we're not even individuals. Did you, do you remember you telling me this?
Oh, I think that I said individual. We were talking about this kind of stuff, and I said something like just individuals, that we have to get rid of that word because
Mhm.
it's something to not be able to be divided.
Yeah,
Doesn't fit
yeah.
in like a Neoplatonic hierarchy of being. Um, the analogy that I'm thinking of that is about this question, there's a kind of thought experiment. I got it from Jonathan Peugeot. Surprise, surprise. But um, he talks about like the way that anything exists, and so he uses the chair as an example. And so the way that a chair exists, like you could see the leg of a chair, and if it separated itself off from the rest of the chair, and it was just there, then all of a sudden you don't see chair, you don't see the higher identity, you see this individual part, and all of a sudden there's almost like an ego inflation that leg of the chair gets when it's separate and on its own. All of a sudden it's recognized for its individuality, but it's actually not a leg of a chair then. It's not, it's lost its identity, like you were just saying,
It's a
Dr.
stick.
Schindler. It's a stick. Yeah, if anything, it's like, is this a weapon? Is this something to eat? I don't know, but it's definitely not leg of a chair in the
Yeah.
way like last time we talked about our participation in the hierarchy of being going up, these levels of, it's almost like there's a great hierarchy of being and then there's distinct tiers. I'm sure there's really good ways to talk about this, but there's the level of our cells coming together into our organs. And if that cell was just taken out and put on the table, there's kind of like this fantastic, freedom from that it has, and then it's just going to die, of course.
Yeah, for about a half a second. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's kind of the fear. People talk about the modern world as like a cut flower, and I think that's if we do lose our roots in the good, I think it has all to do with this movement from seeing God as the good. I'm only I've learned this from you guys. This movement from God is the good into God is the most powerful being, and how that has inflated power to kind of take over this participation in a higher thing. And there's also a way that it seems to me like when you come to something's identity, anything's identity, there's like it when you before you can grasp it, it self empties into like this higher thing. And so before you can grasp the leg of the chair in its individuality, it kind of empties itself into the existence of chair, which empties itself into the chair and table set, which empties itself into like a whole household. And there's a way that then, I see this kind of this Star of David kind of thing happening where the Son of David totally solves that, where you self-empty all the way up, but then the source of all reality is this self-emptying back down and filling the hierarchy kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it seems like Christianity offers a real solution that God is the good, and the good is something like that. The movement upwards, the movement to higher levels of intelligibility are like real. It's something like that.
Yeah. I mean, just that I like that comment you made about the ascent that then actually is a descent as well. Paradoxically, I mean that connects with the point made earlier about Socrates and the Republic. We're not going to pay attention to the individual. We're going to pay attention to something higher. But then it turns out that the individual gets most fulfilled
Yeah.
that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that the way up turns out to be also a way down, but the order is crucial. It's because of the priority of the way up that the way down gets elevated. I think that's really, really important.
How are we ever going to realize that the problem is not solved through the political? Because I almost feel like we're moving more and more into that direction. I don't know if you guys sense a similar feeling, but I sense this very strongly. Um, yeah, I don't know, David, if you have a response to that.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, it's not a problem to go to the political as long as we understand the political properly. Here, my dog is joining me. um, she heard the talk of the hierarchy of being and wanted to participate here. The if we understand the political precisely in these ontological terms as participation in the truth of being, then there's no way that can't somehow be turned into a proper, there's no way that one can take that doesn't actually have a possibility of opening up to the larger picture. So I think that's helpful to keep in mind. But what that means is that um, the key question is never first how we're going to, the direction we're taking. The first is what are the nature of the terms that, so you say, yes, political. Let's think about what political means. Or, yes, the individual, but what is an individual? Yes, rights, but what are, any of these things you actually can start to unfold and they open up to the larger picture. So that to me is the crucial point, I think.
James, any response to this or insight?
The thing that struck me when Matthew was talking about taking the cell away and it has this amazing freedom for a moment, is the notion of freedom that has become common, the ability to do whatever you desire, and that's not the notion of freedom that it's not the notion of freedom that the ancients were familiar with, and it's not the notion of freedom that I found when reading Kant, and I don't think it's the notion of freedom that when our country was founded is what wasn't the ability to do whatever you wanted. I had this argument with a friend of mine at the University of Georgia when I was a graduate student because he was all into Kant and he kept saying Kant, elevates freedom and he means freedom to choose whatever you want. And I'm like, that's precisely not what Kant means. Because if I'm following my desires, and Kant makes this point explicitly in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, if I'm following my desires, I'm not self-determined. I'm being determined by the object of my desire. So I'm not autonomous, self-determining, or a self-law. I'm heteronomous. I'm being determined by the other. I'm only free or autonomous when I'm making decisions basically that are universal, that are in line with the universal. That for Kant was pure reason, pure a priori, prior to experience. Reason. And I found this when I was reading Hegel for the first time. Hegel was very difficult, but he kept talking about freedom, but it became clear to me as I read him more. Freedom was being one with the absolute. It was being united with the universal, or to put it in Christian terms, being one with God, or more metaphysical terms, being what a human being is supposed to be. That is what freedom is. And so when I am my nature, when I am what I am, then I function the way I'm supposed to function. This goes back to Aristotle, I think, and or probably more than just Aristotle, but it is all about being the right kind of thing, not and then doing the right kind of things follows from being the right kind of thing. And I am free when I am what I'm supposed to be, not just doing what I choose to do. If I just follow my desires, that's not freedom. And we've really got that messed up today.
Oh, yeah. I mean that. My dog was just barking there. I think dogs by nature bark at mailmen for some reason, and it's weird that they can all recognize the mail truck. They recognize it. They'll see another van pull up. It's not for some reason the mailman triggers barking, but that's a free act because this is what they're determined to by nature. With Kant, it's kind of so. Hegel's notion of freedom I think it's one. I mean, even though Hegel is a complex person and has, some very questionable presuppositions here and there. He's fascinating, endlessly fascinating to read. And I actually think that his definition of freedom is probably the best that I know of in the modern world, which is in German bei sich sein in einem anderen, being at home with oneself in the other, is how that's usually translated. Which I mean, that's a very different sense of freedom from what we're used to. He incorporates free choice and self-determination, but inside this being with the other in this fundamental way. So, and with Kant, it's your description of Kant, that was probably the most concise and illuminating uh, characterization of Kant I've ever heard. So thank you for that. That was really, really beautifully done. With Kant, you do get a bit of this sense of you still have a certain dichotomy between you're either determined by yourself or you're determined by the other, and you want to be determined by yourself. And I gather that that's one of the things that Hegel's definition is trying to overcome, this sort of opposition. But it's interesting if we approach it through that hierarchy of being and participation that Matthew was highlighting there. You realize that the key is the more deeply you go into yourself, the more simultaneous the determination by the self and determination by the other is. If relation is at the heart of being, then to enter into the heart of your being, you're not being imposed on from the outside, and yet the other is there and present, and co-determining you. So it seems to me here again we see how the metaphysics, whether you've got like a radically monistic substance ontology or you recognize the depth of relation, that goes to the core of this question too.
I remember rebelling against these beautiful constraints in many ways. The first time I found out, kind of realized like you are what you're supposed to, like what you said, James. We are, or we should. Freedom is becoming what you're supposed to be. And I hated that as a teenager. I heard that.
Yeah.
I told my father that sucks, and that was that individualized, atomized person, rebelling against that. But I think the submission to that, in other words, the submission to God is the most liberating things there is. But I think to many people it will sound suppressing.
It takes a little maturity. You should talk to my oldest son there, maybe convince him. He still thinks it sucks. We've had many conversations, and yeah, I mean, he's 17, so it's going to take a while.
Fair enough.
Resonate.
It's hard because Christ says in one of the Gospels, "My yoke is easy." Well, okay, it's easy, but it requires giving up everything that's yours, and that really isn't so easy. It means surrendering myself, and that's a hard thing to let go of.
Yeah. Maybe a question for Matthew. You got married quite early in a modern world. How come?
Yeah. Oh, sort of. I was so far removed from the modern world by then, living in Protestant missions. A huge reason is because I left the modern world, joined missions, and then I had a whole bunch of beautiful, strong models just at that next stage of, early 20s. And so I could see those families, and I just found it attractive. That's probably the most direct way to answer the question. I found it so admirable and attractive. And then I met Shawnee, and so away we went. I wasn't gonna let myself disappear into leg of the chair when there was this higher thing presenting itself. One thing, if I can, this is a little bit to the side, and it's so like unpolished, but it's kind of the thing that I've been thinking about a lot. It's still within this question of what is church, which is what we spoke about last time. And it has to do with seeing our current state in the modern world through the lens of the story of creation. And so what seems to be, okay, so here's something I only found out recently. usury was banned in the church. Like in like 300 AD or something like that, and then it's been unbanned very, very recently. And that was like, oh
Well,
wow,
actually specified. Usury is still banned, but lending money at interest isn't according to certain conditions. But usury as such is still banned. That's an important point.
interesting.
Nobody
In
recognizes that, but that's true. Anyway, sorry
Okay,
to interrupt. But, yeah.
no, that's so interesting. You mean in the Catholic Church, it's
In the
banned.
Catholic Church, yeah, right. It's still condemned as a sin, usury. I mean, but now it's been redefined. It used to be understood to be any lending at interest, and now there's been a kind of development of doctrine where it's recognized that there is a certain work involved. It's not like you're getting money, from nothing, but
Hmm.
there's and risk involved and time and so forth. There are constraints. So now usury means exorbitant interest, sort of
Okay.
unreasonable interest. So
Great, thank you. Yeah,
yeah.
so but the theme I feel is consistent this because our world, the West, has moved so much um, away from thinking that that lending on credit is so inappropriate, and we've developed a world so much around that. So I
Mm-hmm.
remember hearing you, Dr. Schindler, a while ago say what I just said a minute ago,
Mm-hmm.
that like the switch into the modern world is somehow fundamentally theologically, it's this movement from seeing God as the good.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way the ancients saw, and I see that within this kind of Neoplatonic vision, and then a switch into God as the most powerful being and how that accidentally almost elevates power.
Yeah.
I've seen that as debt, and that's just kind of like revealing itself more and more to me, and it's like when you do that move theologically, inevitably what happens is that you lose the church and you replace it with the bank.
Yeah.
And so it's like inevitably it's this kind of taking taking something too quickly. And
Yeah.
so the word that's used when Eve says the serpent tricked me to take the fruit, the word means to lend on credit.
Mm-hmm.
It's this word to take something that's what do you do when you lend on credit? It's impossible for me to buy this thing. I can't afford it. Oh, but I want it anyway. And so,
Mm-hmm.
all I have to do is I just have to sign my name. I just give my identity. That's all. Just my soul. And then I get to have this thing when it should be impossible. There's this little magic that
Yeah.
the serpent can use. And the modern world, like even from your guys' generation to mine and Lucas's, has become so much more about buy now, pay later.
Yeah.
You can buy groceries on credit now.
Yeah.
There's companies emerging that are becoming extremely profitable, extremely powerful, where you can buy a pizza on credit and you can split it up across payments over the next few months.
Yeah.
And it feels so somehow just so intimately tied to this movement into individuality, and somehow it's something like giving away our identity or a piece of it,
Mm.
and we seem to be just kind of like cycling in that direction, to the point where it becomes very hard actually to live in the modern world without becoming
Yeah.
a part of this system of credit. So
Yeah. Right. Right. No, I'm sorry. Can I
Please.
I'm on the edge of my seat here. That's really no, that was really insightful. There's a lot there that's worth reflecting on. I didn't know that about the verb. I'll have to look that up with Eve and the serpent. But what is I think illuminating. You mentioned now our supreme authority in a certain sense is not the church, it's the bank, as you said. I mean, if you think about it, when power becomes the highest standard, the highest act and the strongest principle, then of course the bank has more power than the church in a way, and so it's going to stand as a kind of an
Mm.
ultimate. It's going to trump. And I think it's also illuminating to think of how it is that money. What's the in the I always go back to the pre-modern modern. I mean, some people get tired of that, but I just find it so illuminating. It is, one of the shifts from an economic perspective in the transition, you might say, from the one to the other culture is a move from in the understanding of what wealth is. And wealth was previously identified principally with land. Land was like the fundamental symbol of wealth, to be a landowner. But now the symbol of wealth is money. And what's the difference between money and land is, money you can put in your pocket, and land you can't. And in fact, you don't even have to put it in your pocket. You've got your whatever app. So what's happening is your money is wealth that has been separated from reality and becomes just pure power, purchasing power.
Yes.
That's not rooted in anything real that would give it natural constraints and a kind of natural order and a connection to natural human life. And built into it is here's a kind of an amazing little magic trick that happens, is that it seduces you precisely not to flourish as a human being. If I can not spend money, I will increase my power.
Interesting.
So in a way, there's a kind of a seduction away from precisely the things that fulfill you. Whereas land doesn't work that way. And there's only so much land that you want, right? And there's only so much fruits of the land that you want.
That's true.
You wouldn't multiply it by infinity. What would you do with all that grain? It would rot. It would create a burden. There is a limit to the most you could possibly want, but where's the limit to money?
Right.
It has no limit, and so there's a kind of a logic to make it the most powerful thing, precisely in its nothingness, which is so extraordinary.
James,
so it becomes purely psychological, even. Yeah.
No, I'm curious if James has any thoughts.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about was money is not tied to any reality. Well, it used to at least be
gold.
Great. Yeah, the gold standard. I was thinking of the gold standard. At least we had tied it to something. This little piece of paper represented this much of this. And then we got rid of that. And now it doesn't represent anything but what I think it represents. And that's, I was thinking of one of Tom Clancy's books. I used to read lots of Tom Clancy before he got too popular and they stopped editing. And he had this scenario where somebody hacked Wall Street or whatever and completely blew up, our entire economic system by destroying Wall Street. And Jack Ryan, the main character, figured out, well, this is all imaginary anyway. If we just think it's okay, it'll be okay. And so he gets his big friends to the next day when Wall Street opens to act like nothing happened and start buying again. They did, and problem solved.
Yeah.
So it's completely imaginary, completely illusory.
Well, maybe a little aside. Robert Breedlove, who you've spoken to, David. You know Robert, right? Yeah. So he's a big proponent of Bitcoin as a sort of digital version of gold to get us back to money that's somehow limited. Even though, and it's funny because Bitcoin is in some ways,
less real.
It's immaterial.
Yeah.
It's the most abstract thing, but somehow it's tied into reality, and that becoming a bit technical here, but it requires energy to verify, and there's a limited capacity to it. So it acts similar to gold, but gold can still be found in the earth. So that limit can still expand, but Bitcoin is supposed to finish expanding. What do you think of this this idea? Is this just going back a little bit and trying to get a little bit of our grasp to reality back, or is it even a worse thing?
Yeah, I have no idea. I go back and forth on that because for precisely the reasons. I mean, because it does impose constraints that are not there otherwise. It does separate. There is something separated from the kind of institutions of power that could be healthy too. On the other hand, it does that precisely by getting further from reality. And so there's it could end up being another one of these sort of diabolical trades that we're taking for what seem to be good reasons. But I don't know. I don't know for
Yeah.
sure. But you know, the one thing about the imaginary point about money that I think is really worth thinking about is um, the value of money isn't just what you think it is, it's what you're able to convince somebody else to pay for it, you know? So in a way, there's built precisely in its separation from reality is built in a way, a need, a necessity for manipulation and um,
Mm.
uh, I mean, trickery, really. What
Yeah.
is that? I mean, you know, what do you call if it's totally arbitrary what a person will pay for something, given that, then what is it that will determine it? It can't be anything but manipulation.
Yeah.
There's no real foundation for value then. I mean, that's a pretty disturbing logic to institutionalize and, you know,
Competition. It's
yeah,
competition. It's what if you'll give me this for it, well, he'll give me this for it.
Yeah.
And then, well, this, and so we determine how much it's worth by the most somebody will give me for it.
yeah.
Is the
That's
move
right.
to money in general already a bad move, given that it allows us to go to uh, different cities to barter there without needing any
Mhm.
relationship? How do you view that? Maybe David can answer first.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it seems to me that this is why I always say just we always need to go and ask about what something is.
Mm.
And if you know, if you ask if money is a token of exchange, um, then you have built into it a purpose. The purpose of money is precisely to facilitate the exchange of goods. And it seems to me that when money is entirely put at the service of actual human exchanges, it has its proper place, and it actually has a kind of an importance, and it will enable. I mean, I think it's really crucial when you make that move. You're already affirming human exchange as central, and that then will
Yeah.
build into it a kind of priority to the local without excluding then the traveling to exchange, but it does give a certain priority to the local. But what happens is that for us now, goods, I mean, this is something that Marx had some insight, I think. You know, even though I don't follow I mean, he was diabolical in all sorts of ways, but he had some insights, and one of them is, you know, what happens when you make goods kind of instruments for the prolif proliferation of money. That the point of having things is to be able to get more money. Then you've actually perverted the very nature of money. If it's defined in this other way, then it's no longer you've actually separated it from its true nature,
Yeah.
and it's given it a distorted nature, and now everything is going to kind of go out of whack. So I think money in principle is not a problem if as long as we um, interpret it relative to reality as opposed to making it the reality to which other things are relative.
Is this a difference of relation and substance? So
Yeah.
it's almost like what we've done is we've
Mm.
substantialized value. And
Hmm.
it's like, hold on, no, value was the relation. And so once we start treating money itself or value or relation as something that can be traded, and that's what it means to lend on credit. It's the same move, like the financial system and to finance. It's like you're trading value, and it's like, hold on, that it's almost like, yeah, like a substantialization of
Right.
value. That's
Right.
like a lie. It's for sure a lie, it seems like.
Yeah.
James, any response to that? Does that align with how you think about it?
Well, I haven't thought too much about value in and of itself. But yeah, this idea of exchange, I like that.
Mm.
And I think that that's does express a relationality that I think is important. Um,
Yeah. When
yeah, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, no.
I was just thinking, arguments I've had with people, what determines the value of something? It's whatever somebody will give for it.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, but I'm not sure that's a good way to define value, but it certainly seems to be the way we define it today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a better
Yeah.
way,
No, it's
David?
Well, it is tricky because you do wonder. You want to say that there has to be something real and ultimately some grounding in nature, in the nature of things, at the root of value. But it is tough. I mean, because it's clear that there's something arbitrary also about value. I mean, there is it is the case. We want to say that uh, a product that somebody makes without any effort is very different from a product, even the same product that has maybe cost a person's whole life to make. You want to say, well, yeah, the second is more valuable. Now, why is that? I mean, there are things, and so I don't know. This to me remains. I'd like to. I know that there has been some. Aquinas has some texts on this. That this was a huge debate in the Middle Ages that we've bracketed out, but it's not something that I have studied
Yeah.
closely.
Well, who are we to put value into money terms? Because this subjective notion of value is deeply rooted inside of the idea, well, the value has a quantity to it. And so
Yeah.
maybe we need to give that value up to something else.
This idea that something has more valuable because it's more difficult or requires more effort is an interesting. I remember one of my early philosophy classes at the University of Dallas, where I fell in love with philosophy. My professor, Dr. William Frank, if you're familiar with him.
Oh yeah, Bill.
He was like my first philosophy professor that taught philosophy in a non-analytic way, so I fell in love with it. So
He's great.
he's a good guy. He asked one day in class, he said, he's talking about he didn't put it this way at first. He said, Aristotle says if something is moral or ethical, it's pleasant. And Kant says exactly, or seems to say at least, I think it's nuanced, but he says exactly the opposite. If you get pleasure from it, then it doesn't have moral value. And he said, which one do you think is right? Because he said, is it, he put it this way, it's something that you find pleasant to do, more morally valuable, or is it have more value if you strive for it and have to work hard for it? And my gut reaction was, well, it seems more noble if I have to work harder for it. But it's as I've come to see, Aristotle, I think, is more accurate because for Aristotle, the reason I get pleasure from it isn't because my desire is inclined to it. It's because I'm the right sort of person, and doing that thing comes naturally to me. And if it comes naturally to the kind of person I am, well, then of course it will be pleasant because there's no conflict. It doesn't require any effort because it just flows out. And I think that's a much better understanding of morality and moral value than the idea that, oh, well, I have to work so hard. And if I deny my inclinations and just fight through and do it, that's, I'm a really virtuous person now. Well, that's not the nature of virtue as, it's classically understood.
Yeah, I mean that's Aristotle makes a distinction there between the virtuous and the continent. That means something different to us, but a moral continent, someone who does the right thing but has to struggle to do it, is not as virtuous as the person who does the right thing.
Yes.
Unthinkingly, spontaneously, with great pleasure. Yeah. I
Well,
mean,
that's our journey, right?
Nails it. Sorry?
That's our journey, I guess, to go from struggling through it to hopefully. I was just speaking to James about this last time. It's like, does it get easy at some point? I don't think it ever really does, but maybe it gets easier. Yeah, absolutely. I have so many ways I want to take this conversation. Maybe rights is a good one because I think last time we spoke, James, you said you had some frustration with the modern notion of rights. Maybe you can expand a bit on that frustration, and then maybe David can take it from there.
I'm probably a little bit simplistic in the way I view rights. I get some pushback on this when I express it publicly. But I'm not a fan of rights. I don't like rights. I don't like the idea of rights. Rights to me seem to reside in the individual, and there's something that can be demanded from somebody else. I have a right to this, so you owe me this. You have to do this. You have to treat me this way. Or somebody else has a right, so you have to do this for that person. I like the idea of obligation better. I have obligations to do certain things for people. It's not something that can be demanded from me. Well, it can be demanded from me, but not from that side of the equation. It has to be demanded of me from my side of the equation. It's demanded of who I am. I like the idea of obligation much better than the idea of rights. I haven't worked anything out systematically on that, but you know.
I totally agree. I won't give you pushback. I'm totally on your side on that. I mean, it's really interesting to tie this back into the earlier part of the conversation about liberalism. I mean, rights is one of the ways when you found political order entirely on atomistic individuals. That's then the notion of rights becomes kind of the fundamental thing. But think about it by contrast. What if you make goodness, the good, the fundamental reference point? Then that builds into it a notion of obligation. I mean, the thing that's interesting about the rights, you have the rights of the individual. Because this individual has a right, I have an obligation to
right
to fulfill it. But what if that individual has no power? Then no matter how much how many rights we ascribe, they're not going to bear on anybody. We can just ignore. So I mean, this is why it's really interesting. Not to introduce all sorts of complicated and hot button issues, as they say. But this is the issue with abortion. If you make it in terms of rights from a liberal perspective, the unborn can't rebel or protest or so there's nobody so suddenly these rights claims just get ignored. It's very different if you start from the good. Then what's implicit in the good is that everybody gets their due. So what we want from rights gets fulfilled. But what's interesting is the principle is something we all love and want, which is the good. So it's founded on a positive desire for goodness that defines all of us, and that then becomes the context for our serving the needs of one another, as opposed to just individuals arbitrarily making claims on us. And once rights are detached from any nature, anything can be called a right. I mean, there's no constraint. You can have a right to whatever you want and suddenly make demands for it. And
that's kind of one of my other questions is like, okay, if we're going to talk about rights, where do they come from? Where do they originate? Thomas Jefferson said, endowed by our creator. Well, okay, well, we don't really buy that anymore. And if you did want to say that, well, how do you know which ones are endowed and which ones aren't? It's kind of just become, well, I want to do something, therefore I have a right to it. And, you don't have any say as long as I don't hurt anybody else. Well, and I ask my students when we talk about this, I was like, well, what does it mean to harm?
Oh, right.
What is harm? John Stuart Mill talked about this, and because it's kind of, as long as we're not harming anybody, but he recognized that this notion of harm is kind of difficult to pin down. If we tend to reduce it to physical harm, you've hurt, you've made me feel bad. That's harm. Well, no, it's not. It's not harm. My dentist makes me feel bad all the time, but it's for my good. It's not just feeling bad, and it can't just be feeling bad that defines harm. And I think the ancient understanding of harm is as being precisely involved with my nature. It's something that damages my nature, what I am. That's what harm is. So
That's
sorry.
when I was, it just reminded me a little, when I was in college, I was a pretty heavy smoker and would sit with friends in this cafe on campus. And one day we were sitting there with our cigarettes and we noticed a new sign on all of the little tables that said, not no smoking allowed, because of the dangers of secondhand smoke. And my friend and I were just saying, well, I mean, what they really should do is that there should be an even more strongly worded sign there that says, no banal conversations permitted. You know, because of the danger to the souls of people that might overhear you talking about nonsense. That would actually make a lot more sense to me. I mean, just a little physical harm from smoke is one thing, but having your soul contaminated by banal thinking, that strikes me as far more dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. I guess what
Needless to
under
say, we didn't win that argument, but
I guess what
bad.
underpins a lot of it is, well, coercion is spoken about a lot in the, I guess, as liberalism and libertarianism as well. Spoke about John Stuart Mill's non-harm principle, the idea that you don't inflict on another person's property. I think that's kind of where it comes from as well. Um, yeah, this idea of coercion seems to be the big issue that that gets taken there, and yeah, I'm not sure where to take that. I think taxes is an interesting one as well. Um,
mm,
how would you look at taxes from a maybe more relational worldview? Um, because I often hear this phrase in these circles of taxes are theft because we are coerced to give this up. Um, how do you look at that maybe from a relational or a Christian worldview? Maybe James can start with that one.
I haven't thought too much about taxes. Um, I
Are they natural? Are they part of us? Like, is it something that is healthy for us to have in our lives as a society?
well, I think, and I'm sure David is more in tune with the political history of this than I am, but it seems to me that the idea of taxes, at least, goes to supporting the common good. It's something that everybody is being uh, asked, quote unquote,
Yeah,
to contribute for the greater good of society as a
please.
whole.
Yeah.
Uh, Although asked in a very, uh,
with a gun to their head.
yeah,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah, basically.
Um, but I think in a proper society, it wouldn't be coercive. It would be um, at least no more coercive than the idea of doing something because it arises from your nature is coercive. My
Yeah.
nature coerces me to
Mm,
do this because that's what I am and that's what I'm supposed to do, but not because I have to, but because it just arises. If we had a more proper society, taxes wouldn't be coercive in a problematic sense. They would uh, be given freely,
Yeah, happily.
freely,
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah.
Yeah,
unfreely, freely.
it's interesting. There's a yeah. I mean, right. The key is whether it's connected to a common good. I mean, the question becomes so much more ambiguous now because our sense of political order has nothing to do with the common good in the
mm,
classical sense. And so you are giving up money for things that are problematic, put to
exactly.
problematic or really pointless uses. That's a very different sort of question. But in principle, it's a positive thing. And you mentioned freedom. It's kind of interesting. I once participated in this. There was a Catholic sort of lay movement called Communion Liberation that I spent time with for a year or so. When I was a graduate student, I was really intrigued. They charged dues, weekly dues, or maybe monthly, I can't remember, of the members. And it was kind of interesting. They said that it was pedagogical.
Mm.
And it was intriguing actually. They said everybody who belongs to us has to pay dues, but you determine how much, and we want you to think about what it's going to be, and then you commit to that faithfully. So it can be a quarter if that's all you have, or it can be whatever if you're. And they said the point is twofold. It's kind of interesting. On the one hand, you learn a certain fidelity of commitment to something if you are pledging to give money to it, and a certain amount that you remain faithful to, even if maybe in some circumstances it'll require sacrifice of some sort. And then on the other hand, the more you actually give, if you are investing your money, your heart is going to be more in it at the same
Yes.
time, because
Yeah.
you're going to feel investment. You're actually, you've got skin in the game, as it were.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's actually really true, and I thought very insightful into human nature. And you can think of a political community that's truly healthy, having something of that. You feel more deeply connected to it if you're also helping to fund it.
It reminds me of the church tithe.
Mhm.
It's one of the things as a Protestant that got hammered into me a lot more than as Orthodox, or I think even as Catholics. Oh man, Protestants hit tithing. Give 10%. Got to give 10%. 10% off the top before anything else. 10%, 10%, 10%. You're not coerced to do it, but you are sort of badgered after it.
Yeah.
But not I don't think in a bad way. It's something that I've carried. It's probably one of the main things that as a Protestant I carried over into Orthodoxy is tithing. And it seems to be something that not a lot of people do, because it's not emphasized so much. But I see tithing as kind of a tax. I guess one of the questions would be, if you want to talk about coercion, what do you do to somebody who refuses to pay it?
Yeah.
That just shame them. If you don't tithe church, you kind of just get.
Well, I with this movement, CL, it was kind of interesting that they didn't enforce it, but they would bring it up a lot and talk about the pedagogical principle. And I think that you had the experience that if you were not following through, you were hurting yourself.
Yeah.
You actually did feel that. It's kind of interesting. I remember just being struck. It put the whole idea of dues in a totally different category for me. But that I think that's something that can work maybe on a smaller scale. It's very different, when you run it through the layers of bureaucracy and so forth.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's why it all feels so disconnected nowadays, I guess. The scale of it is just completely incomprehensible. You
Is
don't
it
know
the
the
scale?
people.
Sorry, Lucas.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it the scale, or is it like one thing I was feeling, Dr. Schindler, when you were talking a minute ago, you were talking about how, the problem, the internal conflict is that sometimes you pay taxes for something that you don't agree with. And so like I would way rather pay taxes if I knew that my state requiring the taxes was within the same church that I was in. And so if there was the church mediating what is good, and the state cared about that, then the taxes would be very natural. And there's a kind of like turning against myself, or like the snake eating its tail thing that happens when I have to pay for something that I actually hate. It's like, well, I know that's bad, and now I have to pay for it. And so it's like a eating a poison in a way. It's like something you eat something, but it's like against you. And so it's the difference. I was just thinking when you guys were talking about like, what is it that makes me glad to do the dishes? It's like we make these sacrifices so that higher identities like a nation or a family can exist. What makes it appealing to me and attractive for me to do the dishes, which is my little tax for the existence of my family. Like family doesn't come with a cudgel and tell me do the dishes. But what makes it attractive is my existence in a higher thing. It's like once I start existing at a higher plane, I start to see it. It's like it's an attraction. Like this is the primacy of beauty. It's like this attraction to this higher reality, and then all of a sudden it's natural for me, it's the same thing as my cells, that what they're doing to keep me together right now. They're sacrificing their individuality for this kind of higher level of intelligibility. And so, like, I don't know, Lucas, maybe it is corrupting just the size, but I feel like if, nations like America or Canada were within the church, I would have no problem with the size. I'd kind of be happy about the size in a way.
I just hear John Vervaeke in the back of my mind going, "Theocracy, don't do it, don't do it." That's all. That's
Mhm.
all I'm hearing when. But
Yeah.
but but yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Matthew was also the first person to introduce me to this idea. Like, if you have your money, you give it up to the church. That's basically good. That's where you hope you can put your trust into. It's the institution um, that should do the best with it, given the place where it comes from. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, no, Matthew, that was a really excellent. Everything you said resonated with me, and for me, I guess one of the questions would be, and this question actually would bring us into another area. So I don't mean to send us in a different direction, but just to mention it.
Yeah.
It is an interesting question to ask whether um, something can whether there's a point beyond which in the growth of a community that introduces the need for something like a bureaucracy
Mm.
that then in a
Mm.
way can yeah, just sort of disorder this communal relation. But as I'm saying that, I'm thinking, okay, but the church is big.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and people would complain the bureaucracy in the church, but it doesn't seem to be the same thing as the state bureaucracy. So I guess that
Do you see the size as like, okay, this size is fine, but that size is too big?
yeah, no,
Because for me, it's a
yeah,
matter of reaching into the future and pulling. It's that debt thing. It's like
yeah,
you take something that you can't integrate. So like work is, you mediate heaven and earth. You're the mediation. That's what man is doing in the garden. It's like working. There's this logical and very slow expansion. And it seems all through the Old Testament, there's this duality of two brothers where like one is really fast, like Esau with his 400, ready men. And then Jacob, what happens? The angel hurts his leg and he goes, well, I got to go slow with the women and the children. But
mhm,
it's a theme, like it seems to be a theme. It's David instead of Saul. And so it's like there seems to be this way of slow expansion where
yeah,
you're integrating things that your body can actually integrate. So
yeah,
you eat the
that's right.
fruit that reality has told you can integrate. So
Yeah,
eat all these fruits. Just that one you can't. That's poison. You
yeah,
try to integrate that and it will kind of turn against you.
yeah,
And so it's like this kind of biting off more than you can chew. So do you
yeah.
think the size is a matter of distinction? This size is okay, but that one is not, or is it a matter of we've just simply bitten off more than we could chew and we've gotten ourselves into this spiral?
No, that's very wise. Yeah, no, I think it's the latter, and it really is this idea of uh, there's one thing, organic growth. Um, so a tree can reach enormous heights, but it does it in this,
Yeah.
without ever losing its unity and disintegrating. Whereas, I don't know if you're familiar with the sociologist Hartmut Rosa, who he's recently kind of come on the scene. I gather
Mm.
that his books are being translated right now, but a German sociologist. But he says acceleration is like the key defining feature of modernity. And
Yeah.
it precisely is this, just everything has to be done immediately, and that
Mm.
introduces a whole different sense of the way things are connected and ordered, and I think does inevitably lead to the kinds of problems you mentioned.
Hmm.
It's like the joints, they don't keep up with the muscles
Yeah.
growing. We have that
Hmm.
with a
Yeah.
dog. My sister has a dog now, it's a Ridgeback. And
Uh-huh.
you're not supposed to feed it too much because, the joints don't keep up with it. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah,
Mm.
it's like a human being on steroids, and then everything collapses. This
Yeah.
is what I spoke to Paul van der Klee. I don't know if anyone of you is familiar,
Mhm.
but yeah, David, of course. I basically asked him for advice because doing this YouTube thing, and he was like, you don't want to grow this quick. Like that's a big issue because
Yeah.
anything in biology that grows that quick is a cancer, and
Yeah.
it will bring all sorts of issues with it. So I I see perhaps fame as similar to this credit pile of things that's just going to ruin your life in many ways. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's why I always tell my wife that's why I'm avoiding, success. I'm doing my best. Yeah. Not to be, because success always corrupts. So, keep things healthy.
Yeah, healthy and
But
stable.
on that score, we've mentioned work a couple of times. I actually have a list of duties that are required of me by
No
3 p.m.
worries.
my time here in the
Yeah,
household. I'm going to have to turn to those.
I'm happy to wrap it up here. Any closing thoughts, maybe, Matthew? What did you take away from this conversation?
Oh, so much. I don't have any closing thoughts. It felt like a lot of things tied together, especially this idea of acceleration, because to me,
Mm,
that is debt again.
mm,
I hate
yeah.
to be a parody of myself, but I get into a mind and everything I see it through that lens. The acceleration, it's like you reach into the future and that's, you sacrifice the moment. You sacrifice the future for more of what you want in the moment
Yeah.
with the promise that you're going to do more in the future. So you are literally reaching into the future and pulling it. So it is this kind of acceleration. Yeah, thank you both so much. And thank you, Lucas, as well. This is, it's such a joy. I really, really enjoy this. So
Yeah, likewise. James, how was it for you?
Oh, it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It's hard for me because I feel so often like I don't see the world like anybody else sees it. And so I do end up in conversations with people that are, to quote Anne Shirley, kindred spirits.
Yeah.
It's kind of comforting and nice to know that I'm not completely out there on an island all by myself,
Yeah.
That's
individually
wonderful to hear.
isolated,
Yeah,
Right.
not a
That's right.
substance.
yeah,
Here we have an experience of a relational ontology.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, I mean, totally off topic, but I just can't help but say this, Lucas. Every time I look over at you, you look like a Van Gogh painting to me. Your face against that blue background. It's just,
I'm
it's
disappearing.
been, yeah, yeah. Anyway, I just had to say,
No, thank you. Thank you. And David, thank you so much for coming on again. Same as you, James. All of
Thank
you,
you for
actually.
having
This
us.
is,
yeah,
yeah,
good to meet you, James, and nice to see
Yeah.
you again, Matthew, and of course, Lucas. Yeah. So,
absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure and an honor, and I'd be honored to speak again. This was a nice introduction to autumn for me. It felt cozy by the fire, wonderful ideas, and yeah, you guys have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully
Thank
until
you.
the next time.
You too.
thank you.
Thank you guys. All right.
cheers.
Bye bye.
Bye.